Okay, great. So I'm Caleb Roop. I'm director of the Swanton Public Library. I'm so happy that you were able to wait through that to be here for our program today. For those who registered and are joining us in the stream on Zoom itself, you're going to have an opportunity to talk to John and ask him questions at the end of his presentation. If you're watching on Facebook, assuming that's working, you can put any comments or questions you have in the chat box, and Katie was monitoring those, and she will forward on those at the end to John. I wanted to start by just giving a brief overview of some upcoming events at the library. On Thursday, the 25th at 6, the library is holding a workshop on essential oils with Barb Schweitzer. What they are, how to use them. You can sign up for that at the recreation department, and there are links on our website and on Facebook, and you'll be able to pick up, dare I say, rather a darling set of samples from the library. And I do not use the word darling that much, but they're pretty darling. Barb did a good job. Harry Potter Night Trivia is next Friday, the 26th at 6 p.m. This is more for adults, but families can take part. There is a prize to the winner, $25, which I hope will serve as an adequate incentive and as an explanation for why the questions are going to be very difficult.
Barely.
You can register for that at the rec as well.
He's going to give me a thumbs up.
On March 31st, we are hosting Vermont Works for Women, and they have a program called Find the Job That Fits. COVID has been quite disruptive, as many important people have said. And in this workshop, Vermont Works for Women they're going to help broaden your thinking about the options that you have. They're going to dispel career myths, and they're going to try and help you get started finding a job that you actually want. And you can sign up for that on the library's website. Okay, so John Schraven is an expert negotiator and raconteur. He uses stories to illustrate conflict perspectives and to help identify the emotional triggers that make conflict difficult to navigate. He has negotiated civil cases for over 30 years and been a featured presenter for legal education courses, business groups, and medical associations throughout New England. He's joining us from Northwest Access Television, and I give you John Schraven presenting Handling Conflict. What's your trigger? John, take it away.
Okay.
That's the thumbs up.
Okay, thank you, Caleb. And welcome, everyone. Sorry for the technical difficulties, but we're past it, and hopefully we'll be good to go. So as Caleb said, I'm John Schraven, and today I'm going to talk about handling conflict. Oh, good. Okay. So let's begin. So today I'm going to talk about what is conflict, what role does perspective play in conflict, fight, flight, and freeze, which is nature's safety protocol, the role emotions play in conflict, suggestions for handling conflict, and really understanding what is in your control and what isn't, because that's really important. So what is conflict? Well, it's a matter of perspective. So I'm going to start out by telling you a story to illustrate about perspective. It's called The Blind Men and the Elephant. So once long ago, there were 3 men who were brought into a room, and they were blindfolded. And into the room was led an elephant. And each one of these blindfolded men was led to a certain part of the elephant. One was led to the trunk, one was led to the ear, and one was led to the leg. And each person was given a few minutes to familiarize himself with that part of the elephant that they could touch and feel. And after a while, a couple of minutes, the elephant was led out of the room, and the 3 men's blindfolds were taken off, and they were brought to a table to sit down. And somebody walked into the room and just asked them a simple question. What is an elephant? Well, the first person said, it's just like a snake. I mean, I could feel it, like a snake moves through the grass. I've seen snakes before, so an elephant's just like a snake. And the second person said, hey, you're crazy. He said, I felt the cool air from the fan of the elephant flapping in the breeze, and I could feel it cooling me. An elephant is just like a fan. And the third person said, you're both crazy. I had my arms wrapped around its trunk, and I could feel its rough bark, and it was rooted to the earth. An elephant is a tree. And pretty soon they got into an argument. And just before it started to get physical, the elephant was brought back into the room. and each one could see that their perspective was true, but limited. So perspective is a great truth that's based on all of the stories that we collect in our lives and our experiences, but it's very limited to us, and it's unique to us. So perspective is limited. Perspectives formed by life experiences, all the stories we've heard, the things that we were taught, things that we experienced, lessons that were specifically taught to us by people that we admired and trusted and cared for, could be parents, relatives, and also the groups that we might belong to. We join groups with people that have similar perspectives, and that can influence how deep a perspective becomes or how intransigent it might become. So conflict is really nothing more than the perspectives or two perspectives clashing and coming into opposition with one another. Here's some examples from history. Now, you can't read at the very bottom of this, so I'm going to read it for you, but this says immigration statistics for the past year show that the influx of foreigners was the greatest in our history, and also that the hardworking peasants are now being supplanted by the criminals and outlaws of all Europe. So you've heard the expression, history repeats itself. And that is true specifically in these kinds of situations with clashing perspectives. Now, this particular cartoon appeared in 1903 in a magazine called The Judge, courtesy of the Ohio State Library and the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library and Museum. So this is something that we've seen before. I have a subscription to newspapers.com, and I went through it and looked for other things where perspectives clash throughout history. And here's another one, horses versus cars. After the passing of the idiot and his reckless driving, the automobile will find its use as a city truck and to a limited extent for businessmen in county districts. There's not one sane reason why it should ever come into general use by any considerable proportion of the people of any community. When refined people go out for a pleasure drive, there is only one way to do it, and that is with a good pair of horses. And as long as such a turnout is within reach, there will be little temptation to go jolting over the roads on a traction engine. Lancaster Examiner, 1905. So the perspectives about change. Is the automobile a good thing or a bad thing? Now, I found many others in my searching through newspapers.com, many on women's voting rights, racial issues, but we tend to repeat these things as we get comfortable and then we face change again. So perspective clash when change is involved. So why do they clash? Well, a lot of times it's because there's a general lack of awareness that perspective is limited and a limited version of the overall truth. It's our little tiny slice that we experience. And what we get into is my perspective is right and yours is wrong. And that's an unwillingness to be able to listen to other perspectives. We fear that change is only subtractive. When I say we're loss averse, right, as a species, we don't like to lose. We fear loss, and that's loss averse. But in truth, change adds to our tool set. It adds to what we have. And sometimes through compromising or negotiation, right, there can be less of what was before, right, but we're generally adding to our toolkit when change is involved. And the other thing about change is it's happening all the time, right? It happens around us daily. But certain things, when they involve our perspective, can involve that clash, and that's where conflict comes from. Now, you can't force perspective change in another person. It's a very personal thing, a perspective. But people can come to their own conclusions about expanding their perspective. But you can change and broaden your own perspective. And that really comes about by listening. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. oh. So, and it begins, what is your conflict style, right? And it begins with kind of introspection. If anybody remembers the first Star Wars movie, when Luke wants to become a Jedi, but Yoda makes him stay on this planet and practice, right? It begins with foundational work involving introspection. And that is, what are the stories? What are your experiences from life that contribute to your dominant conflict style, or the conflict style that you recognize kind of doesn't work the way you hoped it would? It's kept you safe at a period in time, but maybe now it's not working as well as you'd like. Right? So the introspection and examining some of those stories and trying to figure out, where did that conflict style come from? There's generally 5 different kinds, and these are really broad categories of conflict styles. Competing. Okay, it's all about me. That's about winning. And let me just throw in a little bit about the word win. So we like to use winning and losing as descriptors. Did you win? Did you lose? But winning, and the word win, really only has shared meaning when we agree beforehand what it means. And for instance, that'd be like a basketball game. We agree that whoever scores the most baskets, we're going to call them the winner. We agree who scores the most goals in a hockey game, the winner. Okay. Outside that context, when we don't agree beforehand on what that word means, it can kind of mean anything, right? So we talk about, I won this, or I won the argument. Winning the argument might look like the other person just left because they couldn't take it anymore. But that's not really what winning is. Accommodating, so winning is, it's all about me, right? That's competing, more of an aggressive fighting style. Accommodating is, it's all about the other person. And that would be somebody who's generally a people pleaser. Okay? That they really want to avoid the conflict, so I'm going to do whatever it is you'd like to do. Avoiding conflict, very unassertive, and really the only goal is to just not be present when there's a conflict. Collaborating, which is probably one of the more healthy ways of dealing with conflict. It's assertive, and it's a respectful seeking of a solution that benefits everyone. Okay? That doesn't mean it fits perfectly for everyone, but it means really diving into the details and trying to figure out what works the best, that everyone can kind of live with. And compromising in negotiation, we often hear compromising as a bad thing, that you just want to compromise and cave in. So compromising is a faster way of getting out of the conflict. So it's a little bit, I would say, less assertive than collaborating, because you really are trying to find a way to just get it done and move on. Okay. The important thing to realize, though, is that none of us have a single conflict style, right? Just like, and there's new research I've, in the last 6 months been reading about personality. They talk about we have a set kind of personality. Well, the recent research talks about how our personality varies from time to time and situation to situation. Conflict styles are the same thing. You might find that you're a people pleaser, right? And I recently saw a video on the news where a woman who was, I'm guessing I'm making this part up, was kind of quiet, and somebody was messing with her daughter and she tackled the person. And so you might find that you're a people pleaser in one situation, but when somebody you care about is threatened, you go into full-on competing mode. Okay, and you're not worried about the conflict or anything. You are really becoming an aggressive conflict person. So it really varies. But in today's discussion, what I'm really talking about is, what conflict styles are you aware of in your heart that don't work so well, and you'd like to make them better? So, and those are generally reactive styles, where you don't think about it, it's just instant, where you flip into this response mode. That might be not listening, it might be cutting somebody off before the question even finishes coming out of their mouth. But it's something that happens really fast. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit, is how do we create some distance between the input of information and reaction. So what I would ask all of you, not right now, but at some point, can you recall a story that might have contributed to your conflict style? Okay, and what is that like? And that's kind of the beginning of untangling and creating a pause before reacting. Fight, flight, and freeze is, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this, fight, flight, freeze are the nature's safety protocol. It's a way of keeping us safe. It's hardwired into all of us, has been since we were humans. So it's something that happens very quickly. When you are presented with an actual threat, there's an instantaneous hormonal dump, okay? And all of a sudden the blood flow starts going to your arms and your legs, your large muscle groups preparing to get away or fight, okay? The interesting thing about this is that when you're in fight or flight mode, when you react and have a conflict response, an aggressive response, you're not really capable of thinking rationally at that point. So, puzzling through things and working out, should I be worried? Should I say this thing that might be hurtful? It's very difficult to do because at that point, you're either in attack mode, flee mode, or freeze mode. So it's really important that we'll talk about it. How do you create some distance between that? Now, once you're in that mode, it could take 20 minutes to come back down to normal if you go for a walk, or it could take hours. So when you trip into a reactive mode and you're in fight, flight, or freeze, it can take a long time to come down. And that means it can take a long time to be able to think clearly. Okay. The problem with modern world, I say modern world, is that we don't have, as you see in the slide, a tiger chasing us. We're not facing the same kind of threats on a daily basis and in the same amount as we might have done thousands of years ago. So, but we have a lot of perceived threats, social media, right? People who are afraid to write anything that's sincere on social media because they'll be attacked. Okay? And reading emails, reading texts, those kinds of things. How do you read them when you're really worried all the time that you're going to be attacked? And just a word about social media is that it's very easy from a position of behind your screen in your home or on your cell phone to say things that you wouldn't normally say if you were walking down the street next to somebody, because there's safety in that distance. But it sets us up for chronic stress. And what that can look like is you're always in fight, flight, or freeze. Always. And that's not a good way to be, but it's really something that I think on some level, certainly given COVID and the quarantining, that we're all going through right now. And at the very bottom of this, you'll see it's just words. A word about words. Words are really important, the words that we choose to speak. We can reframe things so that they sound a little bit differently and have a different impact on them. But the words that we choose to use are very important. They can really hurt and they can really build up. But there's an importance in language, like which words do we choose to speak? And again, in the reactive state, we're going to speak attacking, running away, or we're just not going to be able to speak at all, frozen. Now, we'll see, this is the first time I've used an animation on this, so bear with me. But this is going to be describing what fight, flight, or freeze looks like. Let's see if I can make this work. Castle cognate is the brain. So here I am standing on the castle and I'm scanning for threats. And what do I see but over a hill, something scary is coming. So what do? Oh my gosh. I panic and I throw the lever and I shut down the portcullis and close off the castle. And then what? I fight. I run away. Or I freeze. You just topple off the castle, frozen. Let's do that again. So here I am scanning for threats. I see something scary. But this time, let's do it a little differently. Pause, reflect, then act. Should I wait? Is this real or perception? Should I shut the castle down? Let's try it again. Asking questions. Why does he look scary? Because I want to evaluate it more. He's being chased. So in this situation, as an example, I knew that was going to happen. That cartoon is an illustration of what happens when we put a little bit of pause before the reaction. The idea behind that is twofold. One, we want to prevent that reaction. And the second is we give us some time to get some more information to evaluate the threat. Now, it might be social media. Right? It might be something that we see and we had that feeling of dread or panic. But look a little further. Take some time before responding, right? And think about what that could be. Is it a threat or is it not? Okay? Makes a big difference when you put that in, because if you're not in fight, flight, or freeze mode, you can think it through and think, how do I want to respond? Maybe by asking questions. Confirmation bias is one of many different biases that influence us all the time. And this is one that factors in more to conflict, I think. Interpreting information that conforms to your perception, desires, or beliefs. You want it to be true. Past experience says it could be true. It is true, except maybe it isn't. It's conflict based on assumptions. So as human beings, whenever we can't make sense of what's going on around us, we construct a story to explain it. And the story is based on what we know from our past experience. Okay. Now, I do want to draw one distinction, that sometimes that's a good thing. These are not all bad things. Sometimes creating an explanation is the only thing you've got. Right? Your intuition tells you I should run away. Okay? You don't always want to pause. You just want to be able to evaluate it a little bit further. But sometimes there are real threats, right? So you need to follow up. But it's creating an awareness of, am I just interpreting this in the way that I've seen in the past, or can I take some time to evaluate it further? Confirmation bias. So emotions, of course, have a great role to play in confirmation bias and just in conflict in general. So I want to tell you another story. This one's called The Magic Axe. So once upon a time, because this one happened a long time ago, once upon a time, there was a woodcutter. And the woodcutter had a magic axe. And he would take and drive his horse out into the woods every day. And he'd take that axe and he'd throw it into the trees. And it would spin as it sailed towards the trees, and it hit the trees and up they'd go, and they'd come back down in his wagon, chopped and split, stacked. He was a happy guy. I mean, who wouldn't be? I mean, it was easy work. As long as he had his magic axe, he was making money, he was happy, everything was good. Well, one day he sat down to have his lunch, and when he got up, he couldn't find his axe anywhere. I mean, he looked on the ground, he looked around his wagon, he couldn't find it. And, the longer he looked, the more scared he got that it was gone, the angrier he became. And over the course of that afternoon, he looked everywhere. He couldn't find that axe no matter what he did. And this little cloud started to appear over his head, a black cloud with little lightning strikes. He had hours left to go before he could go home. So he took out one of the Swiss Army knife with one of those little blades on it. He tried to cut through a tree and just got angrier. So home he went with that storm cloud over, and he was muttering. He was angry and cursing. And he got just close, almost to his house, and he passed his neighbor's house. And right there on the front porch was a little boy. And boy, didn't he look like the kind of kid that would steal an axe. Looked like a criminal, a juvenile delinquent. But he didn't want to make any trouble, so he kept on going and went into his house. And all night long, you could hear pots slamming and angry voices, and it didn't get any better. And the next morning, off he went, back down out into the woods. No magic axe, just that little Swiss Army knife and that cloud over his head, a storm cloud, and muttering and cursing. And even his horse was unhappy. And he got out into the woods and he spent the morning with that little knife trying to saw through the tree. Didn't get anywhere, and he sat down for his lunch, and he felt something poke him in the behind. And sure enough, there was his magic axe, right where he left it, covered with straw. So he took it out and he threw it up into the trees, and it spun just like it always did. It hit those trees, and up they went, and down they came, split stack, right onto his wagon. And kind of soon that cloud over his head started to dissipate. It started to go away and replaced with normal clouds, kind of sunny. And he started to hum a little bit. And things were starting to turn around for him. And he got back in his wagon and he headed back to town. And just before he got to that place, there was that little boy again, sitting on the front porch. Except this time, he didn't look like a criminal. This time, he looked just like an ordinary kid. So emotions alter our perceptions. So how we feel, are we angry? Are we happy? Are we sad? Influence the way that we actually see things and other people. So in this instance, that anger, that fear over losing the axe really made that woodcutter's perception that this little boy was a criminal, a juvenile delinquent, a thief. When in fact, he doesn't look any different the first time or the second time. He was just a kid sitting on the front steps. So emotions alter perception. Okay, and that's when we get into the things like blame and shame. Right? When we blame people for stealing our property, our axe, right? Which causes shame that people don't forget. Okay. If you want to see the best talk I've ever heard by any human being, see Brene Brown, her TED Talk on shame. Brene Brown has written a number of books, has a number of videos on YouTube and TED Talks, and every one of them is wonderful. So I would urge you to go see those. But blame and shame, right? Shame is the kind of stuff that we carry around, right? Shame stories that also influence our conflict ability, right? Our resolving ability. How do we handle conflict when we feel great shame? Can we stand up and be present? Can we assert ourselves in our own 2 feet, right? On our own 2 feet. So blame and shame, really important concepts that come about and also have an impact on conflict and how we can resolve it. So what can you do to resolve conflict? The first thing is, remember I talked about words. So reframing is one thing that we can do with conflict. So negotiating, because negotiating is what we're doing when we're trying to resolve conflict. So there are 2 definitions of negotiation. The first one is the one we're already familiar with. It's 2 people haggling, arguing over a certain thing. Could be the price of the thing, could be the extent of a contract, could be, I want you to pick the clothes up off the floor and I don't want to do it, right? All of these things are negotiations. That's the first definition. The second definition, and this is a reframing of this, and the one I would hope you would adopt, right? This is an expanding a perception kind of a thing, is overcoming an obstacle. I negotiated the curve when I was driving my car. I negotiated the curve. I got around the obstacle. So there was a boulder in the road. I negotiated around the boulder. Okay, and you see that other picture of the people that are stuck on the dam in their kayak, trying to negotiate getting over that obstacle. So the difference between the two definitions is, in the first definition, it's oppositional, one person, the other person, against each other, negotiating over this thing. Okay. In the second definition, that obstacle is the proponent, the adversary. So when we adopt that second definition, what we're talking about is anybody involved in the negotiation is a partner in trying to overcome the obstacle. And the obstacle may be, I want to buy a car, right? And that person wants to sell me a car. So the object of our negotiation is the sale of the car. It could be the clothes on the floor. It could be the kind of contract that we can agree on. Okay, but we're partners in trying to find a solution to overcome an obstacle. And it's very less oppositional. The result, vastly different. When you're viewing people in conflict as a partner to overcome some sort of obstacle, which could be hurt. It could be overcoming the obstacle of hurting words. But that's what we're trying to do, is reframe it so that we're partners overcoming an obstacle. And that brings up a second point about conflict and negotiation, which is we negotiate things. So we're not negotiating a person's value. It can feel like we're negotiating value, or it can feel like I'm negotiating my value, or you're attacking my value. That's a technique that some people might use. But if you're able to think about it, we're negotiating a thing almost all the time. The clothes on the floor, the value of the car, length of a contract, whether we go out to eat at an Italian restaurant or not, right? Things, right? Behaviors come into it, right? But we're really talking about negotiating things, conflict. We can negotiate behaviors as well, right? But behavior is not my value. So it can feel personal, and there are techniques that people will bring to bear that make it feel personal. Again, we want to be able to create a little bit of space between this feels personal space. This is about behavior. This is about clothes, about a car, and try and create that distance to puzzle it through and not go into fight, flight, or freeze. Hearing versus listening. There's a real difference between simply hearing a sound or a sentence and listening to a sound or a sentence. Now, each of those things, a sound or a sentence, offer a lot more information. One offers a lot more information than the other. Now, I'm going to try and do this because we'll see if we can make this work. You have to play sound from my phone here, so just hold on. Okay. So here's a sound that we might just simply hear, right? Oh, not that one. Hold on. I'm gonna play that one more time. Okay, so a sound of a chainsaw, something that we might hear off in the distance. We acknowledge that sound. Sounds like somebody's cutting down a tree. It doesn't require a response or a reaction from us. Okay, it's based on our perception and our confirmation bias, right? I've heard chainsaws before. I know what they sound like. Okay, different from being visually seeing somebody chasing you with a chainsaw, But just hearing the sound offers us just the information about what is this thing, okay? What if it's a real threat? Yikes. So you hear that kind of a sound? That's a different situation, right? That's going to trip something else in confirmation bias that says, oh my gosh, what is that thing? And you will look around and try and evaluate it further, or you might just leave and get out of the way, okay? So very different way that we interpret sounds based on confirmation bias in our past experience. But what about this?
I don't want to go. I don't want to go and you can't make me. I don't want to go. I don't want to go and you can't make me.
A little bit different. So when we're hearing language, okay, what do you hear? You hear vowels and consonants that are coming into your ear. Your brain's interpreting them and putting them in a sentence form. I don't want to go. Okay, just those monotone, I don't want to go. Okay. However, with language, we can assign it the literal meaning, right? I don't want to go. But oftentimes we don't communicate on that same plane. We communicate underneath. There's a message below the thing that we're saying, right? So the question to ask then is, why? Right? That makes it different. So if I hear a chainsaw, somebody's cutting a tree down, I don't ask myself why necessarily. I can move on from that. But when I hear a sentence like this, it should trip a mechanism, if I can pause, that says why. If I'm reactive, I might just say, buck up and get going, get out, come on, move along, okay? Reacting without asking that question. So that's the difference with language. Language, and part of that's because of how we've evolved over time. This is a particularly difficult time to speak from the heart. And instead of just stating why you don't want to go, you just say, I don't want to go, because I don't want to go to that uncomfortable place of explaining the hidden meaning. So the only way we get to that point, the only way that we're able to get to the place where we can figure out what's really being said is by pausing and thinking about it for a second. And that requires a little bit of a different skill set. So reflective listening is one of many methodologies, and you can go online and you can look up reflective listening, okay, which is suspending your perspective totally, okay, and making sure that you are present completely, which means no cell phones, no televisions, nothing that's distracting, because you're looking for and trying to understand the meaning of what the speaker is saying. Okay, we're going to listen and then reflect back. Okay, now before I move on from this slide, I just want to talk about reflective listening is one of many different styles of kind of communicating and getting underneath messages. There's motivational interviewing. The FBI uses active listening, right? Which is the same kind of thing, how to build trust and build rapport by listening very hard. Okay, all of these things are available on YouTube, people practicing them and with examples of them. Make sure that you're, listening to somebody that's professionally qualified to actually instruct in these things, but there's some really good stuff out there on reflective listening. Now, it's something that if you've never done it before, it's not, you just don't jump in and, become expert at it. It takes a lot of practice. We've kind of gotten away from being able to listen well because we don't do a lot of things face to face anymore. So we do a lot of things, on Zoom because of COVID. But even before COVID, we email, we text, we make videos. We don't meet as much face to face. Certainly that, in the early 1900s when people would meet at the Grange Hall and talk face to face, share news about what was going on, right? We get together as a community a lot more people generally lived in the town and didn't go far from the town, right? But there was a lot more face-to-face communication. And I'm not trying to say one way is better than the other, but we were better at communicating face-to-face when we practiced it more. So now we're practicing emailing and kind of more of an impersonal way of interacting and communicating. So reflective listening can take some practice. So the first part, again, is listening. And I will say that in your lifetime, the greatest gift that you can give another human being is to listen to them fully. It validates that they're a person, that they have worth, that they have value. I would ask all of you to think about, can you remember in your life a time, maybe it was a grandparent. I always hear grandma stories, right? My grandma was a good listener. The time when you were a kid, or maybe later on, when somebody really, really listened to you. What did it feel like? What's it feel like to be that special that somebody's going to devote their undivided attention to just you? So it's a really great gift that you can give someone. In addition to that, it provides you with information that you didn't have before. So when we're listening, if you're one of those people that has a response that just wants to bust out before the question is even done being asked, you're not listening, right? If you're one of those people that likes to overspeak or, do that sort of thing, then that's reactive, right? Now, we've I think all of us have kind of come more in that direction because we don't practice it as much. But what you'll find is that you get an awful lot more information. And, the old story is that if you go to a party and all you do is ask questions and listen to the responses, that after the party, people are going to say, you're the best conversationalist they ever met, right? And you never spoke a word. You just listened and asked questions because you were curious. And that curiosity, which is part of listening, right, really makes the other person feel heard and that you care about them because you listened. So listening, really important, first part of reflective listening in an environment that's quiet, could be a walk, could be in the car, but there's no distractions. And then reflecting back. And this takes a little bit of practice. Reflecting back is just saying what you heard the person say, what they spoke, your understanding of it. So you're kind of paraphrasing it. The whole point of that is that you want to know, am I hearing it right to begin with? Is that what they're trying to say? And that's the first step to uncovering that hidden meaning that's underneath. Okay? Because people will tell you when you're speaking to them and you ask them by reflecting back, do I got this right? Are you saying this? So you're saying, right? And they'll say, no, what I meant was this. So that clarification can come just from that. If I could accurately, this is the best example I can think of, I could tell you everything that was going to happen to you in 2021. I could tell you every stock that was going to go up, every baseball game that was going to win, who was going to win. I could tell you all of that stuff and just download it by speaking to you. How would you listen to me? That's active listening, right? As if it's the most valuable thing you ever heard or you're ever going to hear. So how would you listen if I could predict everything that was going to happen this year? We talked about restating. The reason you do it is you want to understand what the person's saying. I mean, what's the point of listening? Right, that is the point. So we're going to restate it, ask questions to make sure if I got the information right. And then ask clarifying questions. Do you remember when, or if you have little kids, the curiosity of a child? Everything is new, right? What's that? What's that? Those are the kind of questions that you want, but more importantly, it's not developing a list of questions that you think are curious questions. It's developing the skill to be curious, because that's where those questions naturally live and flow from. So it's really a question of being curious about things in general. How does it work? What does it look like? You know, what did they mean by that? But asking those questions curiously, and what another way of putting that is without judgment. So we're going to ask questions without judgment, without evaluating, right? The clarifying questions and reflective listening are not about problem solving. The person that you're listening to wants to be heard, not solved. And, you know, these are things we all experience in our lives. There's no, you know, and I'd also want to make sure you understand that nobody's good, really great, perfect at this. Maybe therapists are a lot better than most. But this isn't something where you gain perfection. It's where you get a little bit better by practicing. And then 6 months later, you get a little bit better than you were before. So it's just little incremental steps, and build on those things, because it doesn't necessarily come naturally. So if you find yourself listening to solve the problem, then it's not really happening. Or if you're listening just long enough to ask the question that you want to ask, then it's all about you and you're not listening. So that's where we want to develop the curiosity of the child that really just looks at something with awe and asks questions about it. What is that thing on the tripod? What's a tripod? What is that doing? Why are there lights on it? Seeking explanations to answer the questions that you have, right? Going back to what I said earlier, when we don't have the answers to the questions, we make up stories to explain them. And the stories are based on assumptions, confirmation bias, the things that we already know. So in order to learn new things and to expand our perspective, the only way we do that is by suspending our own perspective. That doesn't mean saying it's wrong or it has no value. It has great value. But setting it aside for a moment and just saying, oh, I'm going to listen to a different perspective this time. And I'm just going to listen and find out what new things I can learn. It can be wonderful to really learn new things. And so this is one of the ways to do it. Again, you can also find online active, so it's active listening, which is used in crisis negotiating, has great value just in ordinary work. Motivational interviewing, which is used by medical professionals, reflective listening. But any of those things, you can see them online if you want to get more tips and see people doing role plays on how to practice them. So what do you control? What do you do not control in conflict? And this is really kind of something that's very important. You don't control, I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. You don't control the other person. You can't control what their perceptions are. You can't control changing their perspectives. Right? Really, the only thing that you can control, right, is you. So, but there are techniques, you know, and you can go online, certainly you can read books about things to say when you're in conflict, you know, tips and tricks of things that you might say to diffuse things. And those all work to a certain extent. So I'm not disparaging those things. They're wonderful tools that have been tried and tested. But foundationally, it's really important that you do introspective work first, right? To suspend that reaction, create a pause, right? So that you can think through it and provide an answer, okay? And that is totally within your control. But the rest of it really isn't. So the tips and tricks will work until they don't, meaning that using conversational tips and saying certain words might work for a second, but all of a sudden, if it doesn't work and that conversation or conflict gets derailed, now you're back in fight or flight. And that's what we want to avoid. So foundationally, it begins with thinking about how to create that pause. And then you can move on to later on, move on to some of the tips and tricks of conflict. vulnerability as strength. So I'm going to say this first line over again because I think it's really important. After you, everyone else comes first. After you, everyone else comes first. What does that mean? It sounds selfish almost. But what it really means is put your own oxygen mask on first, and then help everyone else out. In this context, when we're talking about conflict, perception, all those things, it means you have to take care of yourself and be healthy and bring the best you to conflict, right? Take care of yourself first, and then you're in a greater position to really be effective resolving conflict. Just a quick story that I didn't make a slide for about bringing your best self to conflict. So a long time ago, I had a dog named Flatlander Ted, and he was probably 12 years old, golden retriever. And he got to the point where he couldn't get outside anymore. He'd go up the stairs and sit on the landing. That's where he'd sleep. Couldn't really make it up the rest of the flight, but he slept on that landing. And one morning I had to get up really early and go to New Hampshire for mediation. And I had everything set, got the clothes, took a shower, put my suit on, went downstairs to get my socks out of the dryer. Well, Ted had left me a present. He left me a present right on that landing, and it was cold, and it squished up between my toes when I stepped on it. So I had to go back upstairs, take the suit off, jump in the shower, scrub my feet and get the dog poop off of it, come back down, put the suit on, come back down the stairs. I got the socks, put them on, went to open the refrigerator. There was no milk for cereal. I said, heck, I picked some up on the way. I got in the car, turned the radio on. I couldn't find a single song I liked. And I was late for the mediation. So which me showed up for that experience? Versus I came down the landing, Ted had slept somewhere else. There was no package left for me. Got my socks, put them on, opened the refrigerator. There was milk and there were fresh blueberries. I love fresh blueberries. Right there in the fridge, put them on my cereal, ate the cereal, got my car, turned on the radio, and my favorite song from high school came on. And I was early. Which me showed up then. So bringing your best self to conflict is also an important thing. And that can look different for everybody, right? Because we all have different perspectives and different experiences, strengths and weaknesses. For some people, it might be going on a run. You know, for other people, it's a long walk. Somebody might listen to music. Somebody might meditate. Somebody might engage in prayer. Whatever it is that gets you centered and calm, you might see a trend here. This is all about centered and calm so we don't react. Centered and calm so you can bring your best self to that conflict when you know it's going to happen. When you get really good at it, you can bring your best self to everything, okay? And minimize as much as possible the negative reactive self, because conflict can spring up, you know, without warning. Right? And so by practicing those things, whether it is running, athletics, those sorts of things, you're better able to respond to conflict when it just jumps out of the bushes after you. Okay? There, as far as exercise goes, and I got to tell you, as I've grown up and grown through life, you know, I kind of made fun and poo-pooed all the cliches that my dad used to tell me and other people used to say. And now I realize that a lot of them are cliches because they're true. Exercise is a good thing. Getting out and walking is a good thing. There's these little things called endorphins that happen when you exercise, right? They make you happier. They boost your mood. They put you in a better perspective. That's a real thing. So things like exercise or meditation, prayer, listening to music, whatever it is for you that works, that brings you down and calm, that's the you that you want to bring to conflict. That's the you that's going to be good at listening, not reacting, and getting to the bottom of the conflict. So the whole point of this is because if I'm going to listen to somebody and I'm going to have conflict, I want to understand where they're coming from. What's it like to be in their shoes? How do they see this obstacle that we're trying to solve? And so bringing your best self to that place makes it easier, versus if you're angry going into it, really likely that it's going to trip and fall right into fight, flight, or freeze. So anything that you can do that works for you now, like producing endorphins and stuff, is unique to every individual. So some people, they can run for a ways and they just feel glorious. Some people might have to run 20 miles to get the same, buzz out of it. But those are things that you can do, especially now in quarantining and with COVID out there. It's really important to find the things that can boost your mood. And make things not as gloomy as they appear, which the last year has not been easy for anybody. So I talked about conflict strategies are helpful. The other thing I want to talk about is that, I'm going to have to look on how we're doing on time. Good. Fears, shame, and doubts, right, are not unique to you. So we all carry around stories of when we were afraid, we're scared and we're embarrassed by it, or stories of shame. Maybe somebody made us feel shamed, or maybe we did something that we were ashamed of. And we carry those around. We don't talk about them that much because we think we're the only ones that have those kinds of stories. And if I share them, people are going to laugh at me, or they're going to mock me, and I'll feel even worse. I'll feel more ashamed. Well, the truth is, it's by sharing stories like those stories in a safe environment, okay, that's what creates connection. That's where that expression of stories connect comes from. Because we're sharing those things, and even though the details are a little bit different, the underlying story itself is pretty much the same. So if you listen to The Moth, and I'm not talking about so much when the comedians are telling stories on The Moth, but if you look up stories of people who are telling personal stories from their lives, you'll hear stories that you thought, wow, I thought I was the only one that went through something like that. You think there's billions of people on the planet. Chances are somebody else went through something like you did. And so that also takes some of the burden off. Right. But again, sharing personal stories about shame or those kinds of things, you want to do them in a safe environment. If you're in a storytelling group where people are just generally and naturally that way, okay, that's one thing. But you want to be careful with sharing personal stories of, whether it's shame or fear or those kinds of things with somebody that will take it and will mock it because they're uncomfortable with that level of sharing. So be mindful of, if you're going to share those kinds of stories. But I will tell you one more story about my most embarrassing story. So I went to high school in Framingham, Massachusetts. And at the time, it was run by the Sisters of St. Joseph. And there was a nun, I know you can't see all of this, but she was probably about that tall. And her name was Sister Denisita. And she still wore the black and white habit. She had promised her mom that she would always wear the habit. One of the few nuns that still did. And she was pretty much loved by everybody in our school. It was a small school in Massachusetts. And Sister Denisita also knew all the business people in the area. She was forever knocking on their doors for charity, looking for money for the Pine Street Inn in Boston and for homeless in general people. So they all knew her. So it was pretty normal for Sister Denisita to get a lot of the kids in the school their first jobs. She would kind of match people up and send them here and there to get their first jobs. Now, the thing about getting a job involving Sister Denisita is that when she got you a job and you screwed up, the employer didn't call you, they called Sister Denisita. And then Sister Denisita would call your parents. And then you'd be upstairs in your room listening to music and you'd hear your mom or dad say, John, Sister Denisita just called. Okay, that's not the call you wanted to get. So she got me a job at a place called the Sheraton Terra. Now, for those of you that have been down on Route 9 and, near Framingham, Massachusetts, been there a long time now, but Back then it was brand new. It was built like a castle. It had turrets. And it was one of the biggest venue places to exist in Metro West area during that time. So all of the fancy weddings and meetings were taking place there. And when I'm talking fancy, I mean, they brought in a chef that just did ice sculptures. I mean, beautiful swans and forest scenes. That's all that chef did. He chipped away at ice and made those beautiful things. And the weddings were 300, 400 guests, very expensive, high-end food. And my job was as a houseman. So a houseman would basically put together the dance floors, bring out the chairs, set up the tables, make sure that there were 12 at every table, whatever, you know, the manager of the banquets would tell us to do, and get them all set up and make sure that things, the physical things were all there, audiovisual stuff, all that kind of stuff. And one day they had a really big wedding. Everybody was nervous, you know, on the upper levels. And yeah, a lot of people, the bride and groom had come in, and I think they had done their first toast. But there was right up the middle of the room was like 6 tables with just about every food you can imagine, roast beef and turkey and fruit and cheeses. I mean, how many cheeses? And one big swan at one table, one at the other end of the table. It was just really magnificent. And the bride and groom and, you know, the party were all up at the head table and talking, and people were eating. And back in those days, I had a buzzer, and my buzzer went off. And then I reached for my walkie-talkie. Now, for usually you don't remember, walkie-talkie was sort of like a cell phone, but not. So I answered the walkie-talkie, and it said, "Can you bring a Jeroboam of champagne up to the bridal suite?" That's a big bottle of champagne. So I said, "Sure." So I went downstairs. I got one of those, you know, fake plastic Grecian urn things, dumped ice in it, found the big bottle of champagne, stuck it in there, got on the elevator, and I went upstairs to the bridal suite where I had never been before. It was a brand new hotel. And so used my pass key. I get upstairs, used my pass key to get into the bridal suite, and hunted around. You know, like, where do you put champagne in the bridal suite? I didn't know. So I looked around for a couple of seconds and found a place that I thought would work. And I stuck the champagne in its big container right there on the floor. Have you ever had to go to the bathroom so bad that you couldn't take another step? Well, I did. And they had a bathroom, so I used it. So I went into their bathroom and sat down on the toilet, and you know, you can imagine the rest, closed the door, of course. And as I was sitting there, I heard the front door open and a woman's voice say, "Honey, I thought we'd never get out of there. Now get those clothes off." I was 6 feet away behind a closed door. And you know what I thought of? The very first thing I thought of? Sister Denisita. So anyway, what really happened was I got up quick, flushed the toilet, turned on all the faucets, grabbed my rag, started scrubbing things, opened the door. Thankfully, the clothes were still on. And I just said, "Thanks, just finishing up," walked out, closed the door, and tried to walk as casually as I could down the hall. Went back downstairs, listened to the rest of the wedding, disassembled things, and went home. And that whole night, I waited for the phone to ring. But it never did. But to this day, that's my most embarrassing story. So those are the kinds of stories that we all have. You know, if I asked you, what is the most embarrassing thing that ever happened to you? Did you ever have an event at school with bullies? Did you ever feel shame when you were growing up in some fashion? We all have those stories. And so it's kind of understanding that the idea that you had an embarrassing moment isn't unique, can really unburden that, unburden you and be able to handle conflict better. Now, some of these stories can be traumatic incidents, right? And you might need the help of a therapist to get through some of them. Some of them are really rough. And that's a wonderful thing. You know, the nice thing about seeing therapists is you can go in for a checkup when you encounter something that, you know, like you might take your car to get the oil change. You may encounter something, a story that you're trying to puzzle through, and go in to get that figured out, right? And move on then to undoing and helping your conflict style and your ability to withstand it and push back that reaction thing, you get closer and closer to being able to do that. So vulnerability, the ability to like let go and embrace your stories for what they are, right? And not, they're part of your story, they're part of your perspective, they are you. And that's a wonderful thing. It's just if some of the stuff gets in the way, being vulnerable enough to own the story can be a very helpful thing. And again, sharing your stories in safe environments, really important. So I'm not advocating everyone goes home and, well, everyone is home, but that people just start unburdening environments where they're not really sure. That's sensitive stuff. So, and my last slide is really about, what conflict in quarantine during COVID. This presents some really unusual challenges. And in negotiation, there's an expression, don't walk in if you won't walk out. So if I was buying a car and I walk onto the lot, and under no circumstances am I going to leave without that car, I'm toast. I'm going to pay whatever they ask me for. Okay. Well, conflict is similar because I've been in this business for 30 something years, and there are plenty of conflicts I can't resolve. Right? There are plenty of them. I mean, you run into people all the time that they're resistant to it. Okay. And it could be worse. It could be angry. It could involve emotional abuse, physical abuse. But there are people in the world that you're just not going to resolve the conflict with. So the natural way to resolve it is to leave, is to walk away from it, right? In order to have a flame, you need oxygen and fuel. So you can either be the oxygen or the fuel, but if you leave, there's not going to be a fire. Okay, so, but in quarantine, when you can't leave, that makes it hard, right? So what happens if you have a conflict you try and resolve and it just gets worse? It's not like you can just leave, right? Now, you can do things, and some of the things I've talked about before, going out for a walk, doing something that separates you from the conflict. Again, that separation may not affect the other person you're having a conflict with, but it will help you, right? It will help you go from the fight, flight, or freeze and come back down to a place of peace and tranquility, where you can maybe set it aside for the moment, okay? Because you're going to be in the same dwelling, if that's the case, right? So the things that you can do are the same kind of things that you do to bring your best self to conflict, right? Whatever that means. But getting outside, just being outside doing anything will be really helpful. Certainly if you can get out and run or do something like that, that's even better. It also lets off your steam, right? We need to do that too, because frustration often happens when we're trying to resolve conflict and you do everything right and it doesn't work anyway, right? So what can you do to just let off that steam? It might be talking to a friend, right? Connecting with somebody, right? Just so you have that connection. It might be reading a book, listening to music, whatever it is that you can do to let off a little bit of steam. Again, bring us back down to that place where we're not in fight or flight again. Really important, and I hope I mentioned this earlier, that really the only thing you can change, the only influence that you have in conflict is you. Okay? You can't change another person about the way that their perspective is. Now, by asking questions, by reflective listening, or just by the act of listening fully, you're giving that person an opportunity to state and speak their truth in a way that they may not have experienced before. And sometimes just being able to hear yourself in a good environment speak those words is enough for the perspective to soften up and begin to change. Again, because most of us just never get the chance to be heard. So just that very action might do it. But what I'm talking about is directly telling somebody, you will have my perspective, is never going to work, right? So when we're in the environment and COVID and facing those challenges, You can't force it. You can only seek to influence it by asking questions and listening. Right. So introspection, I mean, you can do a lot of work on yourself when you're home. And I think I brought that up before, the kind of introspective things that we could do, journaling. It might be writing down the stories from that you recall, things that you can put down on paper that you can look at later. Things that might contribute to unhelpful conflict styles. But again, if stories involve trauma, the kind of things that you're worried about will flip you into fight or flight just by thinking about them, then get some help. And it may be that you start this journey a little bit later on when there's many more therapists available. I know right now that from what I hear, finding time with a therapist or being able to talk with a mental health professional is pretty tough because there are a lot of people stressed out right now. But at some point, if you have those kinds of stories, you might consider that, getting some help to work through the stories. One thing I want to make sure I talk about before we close and take any questions, please do not trot out conflict resolution skills if you are involved in a home where there is emotional or physical abuse. If there are power imbalances, those sorts of things, seek the help of a professional. It's just not appropriate to try and introduce new ways of doing things when you're stuck in the house in an unsafe place. So these are good techniques, the introspections, all that sort of thing. But when you introduce them, could be very important. So just go over what we talked about a little bit, and then I'll take some questions if there are any. What is conflict? It's a clash of perspectives. So what role does perspective play in conflict? Well, we don't like change, right? I mean, we're loss averse and we tend to interpret changes, whether it's based on the immigration slide that we looked at and we perceive this change is going to have a bad impact on us. Well, you can see in 1905 that since 1905 to today, we've done okay, So perspective plays that role, right? It kind of gives us the story, it tells us what we think is going to happen, confirmation bias, right? And that's the role that it plays in conflict. Fight, flight, or freeze happens automatically. Okay? It's not anything that we should seek to shut off, but it's something that we should seek to pause, because all the things that we perceive as threats or stress might not be. Right? And being in constant fight, flight, or freeze is chronic stress, causes all kinds of health issues. Okay? And just as an aside, in the late 90s, there was a study called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Events. It was a lot of people, I think 6,000 Kaiser Permanente did it. And what they looked at was, do adverse childhood events affect health outcomes? So the stories of traumas, the stories of things that went on as you were growing up. Did you have a parent that was incarcerated? Was a parent substance abuse? These are what they consider adverse. Each one of these is a separate category. And based on the number of these that you might have experienced growing up, for the first time ever, they were able to tie those experiences directly with health outcomes. So outcomes, things that we don't want to have happen, adverse health outcomes. So a direct tie. Since that time, since they came out with the first one, there have been many more studies refining and developing them further. But the same is true for most of them, which is what we experience along the way, the things that form our perspective. If there's enough of them that are in certain categories, they can actually affect our health down the road. Okay, that's apart from genetics, but they can have a direct impact on those things. Emotions, the role that they play in conflict, they can basically change how you perceive it. If you're angry, you see a thief sitting on the front steps. If you're happy, you see just a kid. Okay? And what can we do to handle conflict? Things like reflective listening, just listening, right? Just learning to listen and practice listening is something that we can do. And again, I mentioned some of the other things that are out there. So, do a search. There's role playing out there that's available on YouTube. And really important, understanding what you can control, understanding what you can control and what you can't, really important. So that's all I have. I thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. I just want to go through my couple of my credits and make sure that they get on there. Thank you to Swan Public Library, Northwest Access Television for making this possible. In particular, thank you to the people who contributed to the illustrations, the cartoon, and some of the artwork that was there. These folks here did the original artwork, and then photos are from Pixabay under a Creative Commons license. No attribution necessary. So thank you again. And Katie, if there are any questions, I'd be happy to try and answer them.
Fantastic.
Hi, John.
Hey, Katie, I just wanted to, I'm going to end John's screen sharing so we can see his beautiful face. I'm sharing. So we should
I
be
can't hear
able
anymore.
to see speaker. I don't know, with Northwest Access, I don't know if we can still. Can you see John? Can people see John?
Roger is working on the audio.
I can see him
Okay.
on
maybe
the
it's
Facebook
just
live
me.
feed.
John, thank you so much for that presentation. We're going to let people ask questions in a moment. We're going to see if there's anyone on Facebook first.
There
for
are
your-
none. Oh,
well,
sorry.
Okay. I will go first. What I was going to say, though, to everyone is that if you could start sharing your screen and raise your hand if you want to raise a question, ask a question, and I will unmute you. For your information, because we're talking about handling conflict, which it's like it can get into personal territory, which most conflict is. It's like we're going to have a moment for people to ask whatever question they want, but then just to give anyone an opportunity to ask a question and not be recorded and not be on Facebook, we're going to stop the recording. We're going to stop streaming to Facebook, and then we'll continue to ask questions or have the opportunity to ask questions, just in case that is a factor. So get ready to ask a question. Start your videos so we can see your hands. And I wanted to ask John, earlier on in the presentation, you were talking about the importance of self-reflection and introspection, because it's like helping oneself is like the most important part of figuring out how you can relate to others. This is something I certainly struggle with. Do you have any particular resources of methodologies for like where one can start trying to learn how to better understand oneself? Because it's, as I think everyone knows, the human mind is a very complicated thing.
Okay. So just to restate it, so I make sure I understand it, right? You want to know like what resources are there to begin this journey of introspection.
Yes.
Okay, so a lot of it depends on who you are personally, but it begins with things like anything that you can do to get rid of the noise, right? What do I mean by that? The noise will be all this stuff that you worry about and think about all day long. Did I mail that thing back to the electric company? Did I put it in the mailbox? And you think about it all day long. Or the famous one for me, which has happened to me before, like I'll say something to somebody and then I'll think about it and I'll think, God, why did you say that way? And then at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're still thinking about it, like, and then the next day you run into the person, you're all worried that you offended them or something. And you're like, hey, did you watch the show last night? It didn't matter, right? But it's noise, all this kind of noise. I'm not good enough. All of the things that we hear all day long, how do you turn that stuff off? So for some people, it's meditation, I have to say I'm probably as guiltier than most. I mean, that's something that I love and that gets me to that place, and that I don't find the time to, after myself, everyone else comes first. I don't often make the time to do that, but it's really about getting rid of that noise, because it's very difficult to be introspective when all that stuff is going around your head. And, again, social media, which you may have guessed I'm not a real big fan of, that's part that contributes to it. you know, what do people think of me? And there's just so much more of I'm out there in the world in a way that people weren't before, being criticized and viewed. Do I get likes? Didn't I get likes? Oh my gosh, I didn't get any likes. I guess I'm no good, right? All that kind of chatter that goes on. So it's really how do you find that place, and how do you slowly acknowledge the noise and let go of it so that you can start to begin the journey. Some people it's prayer, some people meditation, again, some people it's running, hiking, but whatever it takes to get rid of the noise, because most of that is just that noise. Yeah, does that help?
It does, and I can say that I am a believer in cognitive behavioral therapy, and that's actually very close to what my therapist has said. At least works for him. Of like, just take a moment, meditation, think about getting rid of the noise. On that note, I would just say, in terms of resources, because of COVID, weird silver lining. It's while there's a high demand for therapists, they're in another way they're actually easier to get access to because you no longer have the physical requirements. So if you need resources for how to find therapists by any chance, you can contact the library, and it's or just do a Google search. It's actually pretty easy. Psychology Today has a really great geographic list of practitioners. I certainly find it useful. So there is that as well.
That's a really good point, Caleb. Yeah.
And if you need more information, contact the library. We will give you whatever resources or help that you need. Does anyone have any questions, at least for this period, before we stop the stream? I see Judy, you're raising your hand. Let me unmute you, which I can do. Actually, I'm just going to make it so everyone can unmute themselves. I'm sorry. Mute upon allow participants to unmute themselves. Okay, so everyone can unmute themselves now. Judy, you have a question.
Yeah. Hey, and I apologize because I kept having to, my iPad was doing something very funny. Let me know if you can't hear me. I'm all masked up. So I had to keep going out because my iPad was doing something strange. So big question for you guys is, you talked a lot about how this is really a practice thing, and it takes, you have to learn to get past, to change that fight or flight, or what the other one was, which freeze. How do you think, is that something that people are interested in? I guess it's a question to the crowd. Is that something that people are interested in practicing more? Because I think the more, my personal bias, that the more difficult conversations we have, the more comfortable we are with when we come in contact with other difficult conversations. So I guess it's a two-part question. Is this something that other people would like to maybe practice at another time? Or, so that's first question. Second question is, when you run into something that you really don't have the ability to, or the skills to move a conversation forward, what is the alternative? How can you, is there someone you can call upon to help you?
Sure. Thanks, Judy. So two different questions. I'm going to take the last one first. Yes, there are resources. There are people, usually therapists who are skilled in conversation, like how do you deal with difficult situations, and can offer options. Because I think when you're stuck in a situation like that, certainly repeatedly, where nothing seems to work, it kind of even narrows the focus of what tools you think might be available. So there, and that might be a great topic for another one of these, to have somebody come in and talk about those specific kinds of things that you can do. But there are certainly the same kind of people. I would look online, or I would, 211, or call some of the resources, stop at the library and find out who locally is good, with the conversational aspect of things. But there are a lot of techniques that you can bring to bear. Sure. And then as far as the first question goes, would it be helpful, and this is addressed to the group of people who are still here with us, to get together and practice having difficult conversations? And I think that's a wonderful idea. The only suggestion I would make is that to have a person who has some skill facilitating to be present during that, because if it gets a little dicey or out of control, you want to have someone that can bring that skilled in bringing everybody back to why are we here, to practice, and it's not personal, and to make sure that it's productive. So I think that would be really something, but a facilitator might be a good add-on to it as well.
Thank you.
I would go ahead and say that that would be a useful thing to do, to have, to be in those kind of conversations, to make sure you build up the skill to have them. That would just be great, a great resource.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things you're alluding to, and so in a lot of the things that you mentioned are general conflict management, but when things get tricky, you have the high conflict. Can you talk a little bit more about how that goes different from your normal conflicts, high conflict personalities? Because that's an extra topic, right? That's more specialized.
Yeah. So how do you deal with the really high conflict individuals or people that want to fight, or that are just combative most of the time? Well, the truth is you're not going to convince them to change that. The change is either going to come from within themselves or within the group, or things around them are going to change such that they're required to change it. But it's really a specialized skill set to successfully resolve conflict with somebody who's really stuck in fight mode. Because, a lot of these techniques involve, using words and that sort of stuff in a rational way to try and influence and reframe what's going on. But if somebody is really stuck in that fight mode, the rational kinds of things aren't going to be as helpful. For that, I would really want to turn to some, like that's what crisis negotiators do, in dealing with people that are really stuck in a certain situation, and skilled at talking them down, building immediate trust, because that's one of the things that you have to do, start out and build trust, and then, be reinforcing along the way. Let's find a solution. How do we find a solution? But it really involves quickly establishing a trusting relationship. That's a pretty involved skill set. So it's again, if it's something that people experience in their own homes and that sort of a situation, I really would refer them to professionals to get some help on how to deal with high conflict and how to not let it bury you as well, because that kind of chronic stress can really be detrimental to someone's health. Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't answer it more fully.
Oh no, that goes in line with kind of what I was expecting to hear based off of what you were presenting versus different levels of conflict. Yeah. I guess.
Yeah. I can I've participated in some of the real high conflict situations as to help out as a role player for people who do this for a living. Mm-hmm. And for the people who engage in like active listening, that stuff, it's not an easy thing to just jump into and do, especially when the stakes are really high. You're talking about somebody's life, or getting somebody who's armed outside of a house, that sort of thing. So it's, that, again, even for people who are professionals in doing it. And that's brings up another good point, is that for all of you that listen to this talk and think, oh gosh, I'm not that great at handling conflict. Every single one of us starts out in the same place. We don't know how to deal with it. So, 30 something years ago, I can remember the first time I tried to negotiate a resolution of something, and I prepared for it for like 3 days and then couldn't pick up the phone and do it because I thought I was going to mess it up. Right. So we're all starting, again, stories, we're all starting in the same place, and you can overcome a lot of these things, but it just takes some practice.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, Josh. Does anyone have a question for this kind of general question period?
I have a question to ask.
Hey,
What is some body language we can implement to show someone that we are actively listening in addition to listening to them? Is there anything we can show them physically that or anything that we can avoid doing as well?
Yep. Okay, so what kind of body language is good for listening? So just a word about body language is often misinterpreted. And so this could mean I'm not really happy with what you're saying, or it could be I'm cold, right? So, but this is because it's interpreted as confrontational, not the way I would suggest listening. Arms open, legs on the floor, feet in the floor, hands in your lap, eyes, making good eye contact, if it's appropriate for the person you're listening to. But it's an open environment as opposed to crossed legs, crossed arms, scowling. I mean, those are kind of the kinds of things that are going to send the signal that I'm just waiting for you to be done so I can launch. Whether or not it's true, it could be I just am cold right now, or I could have that kind of look on my face. Could be a sore tooth, right? But you really want to, again, bring your best self there. It's open, right? What do you do when you hug somebody? You do this, right? You can't hug them when you're like this. So, to a certain extent, listening is like, kind of hugging with your ears and your body. You're going to be open to it. Does that help?
That answered it very well. I have a follow-up question too, if it's okay.
Yeah, of course.
What are some signs that a conversation with someone might be starting to degrade, and at what point is it wise to remove yourself from a conversation that's not working out?
Okay, so how do you recognize
could I
when a
interrupt?
conversation is starting to go bad, and what can you do? So it's helpful if you know the person that you're talking to and you have some idea, maybe you've seen it before. But typically in fight or flight, people start breathing more shallowly. They might get red in the face. You might notice that they're starting to tense up, right? And that's one of the things that you can do, like to create that pausing situation. Where do you in your body start to clench when you're about to trip into fight, flight, or freeze? And you can notice it in other people. You might see them, their facial expressions change. Again, they might get red in the face. But those, and when do you leave? That is dicey. So if you're in a place that's confined, and you don't know the person and you're all by yourself, you might not want to wait as long to exit that conversation, right? But if it's somebody that might, right, we have the term vigorous debate, right, which is also something we don't engage in much. But vigorous debate can sound like real arguing. Okay? The difference is after a vigorous debate, those two people might go out and have coffee and just talk about, what they saw in the woods on their walk. Like it's not personal. So I remember the guy was one of the state employees, one of the ambassadors, were being asked questions, and the questions were, I'm not taking positions politically or party-wise, but the questions were really angry questions. And that State Department employee, who's now at Georgetown, I think, she was able to listen to all those questions and not react to the emotion that was being flung at her. And it was one of the most impressive displays I've ever seen of taking those hostile questions and knowing that nothing's going to happen to me, right? Because that's the question that you're asking. If somebody's escalating, am I going to be harmed if this keeps going this way? And so some people, can get very angry, very red in the face and yell and scream a lot, but that's all there is, right? And if you're the kind of person that can weather that and know that there's another side and that physically nothing's going to happen, and they're talking and they're arguing and getting angry about things and not making it personal, right? You might decide to hang in there through the other side. But if you ever have the feeling that somebody's going to come over the table after you at the first sign, then yeah, you need to leave. The whole point of conflict resolution is to resolve a problem. So if you're not going to resolve the problem and you're going to get harmed, get out. There's just no point in staying hanging in there. Does that
Thank
help?
you. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Any other questions?
I am going to let us stop the stream, but no one leave just yet, because I just want
Okay,
to
just
I
can't
want
hear
to
what
thank
you're saying. No.
I want to, for everyone else who's not going to say anymore, I want to thank John for giving this fantastic presentation, and I want to thank Roger and Northwest Access Television for setting this up and hosting John, because the library is not well, it's not well set up to do this. So thank you so much. I'm going to now stop the stream and the recordings just to give anyone else who has joined an opportunity to ask questions that they just don't want broadcast. So thank you very much, and I will see you on the other side of this.